Riverside Gas Station was like any other stop along Highway 75, where late-night customers came and went without much excitement. But on this particular autumn evening, 3 armed robbers were about to learn a deadly lesson about judging a book by its cover, especially when that book happened to be a decorated Army veteran with piercing blue eyes and model good looks. Pine Valley was a quiet town where nothing much ever happened, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and the most exciting event was the annual 4th of July parade. At the edge of town, just off the highway exit, sat Riverside Gas Station, a 24-hour pit stop that served as both a convenience store and an unofficial gathering spot for locals grabbing their morning coffee or late-night snacks. Mike Reynolds had been working the night shift at Riverside for about 6 months now. At 28, with his clean-cut appearance, perfectly styled blonde hair and runway model features, he looked more like he belonged on a magazine cover than behind a gas station counter. The regular customers had taken to calling him Pretty Boy, some affectionately, others with a hint of dismissal in their voices. What most people didn't know, and what would soon become apparent on this crisp October night, was that behind those bright blue eyes and charming smile lay the heart and skills of a battle-hardened Army Ranger. Mike had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, earning multiple commendations for valor under fire. But here in Pine Valley, he was just the good-looking guy who rang up energy drinks and cigarettes while making small talk with truckers and teenagers. The clock had just struck 11:30 p.m., and Mike was restocking the coffee filters, while half listening to the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The gas station was empty except for Mrs. Henderson, a regular who always stopped by for her decaf coffee and gossip before her night shift at the hospital. There was something different about tonight, though. A strange tension in the air that Mike couldn't quite place. His military instincts, honed by years of combat experience, were telling him something wasn't right. The feeling had started about 20 minutes ago when a beat-up black SUV had pulled into the far corner of the parking lot. The vehicle's engine was still running, and its occupants hadn't made any move to get out or pump gas. Through the store's large windows, Mike could see 3 shadowy figures inside, their faces obscured by the darkness. In Afghanistan, he'd learned to trust these instincts, the subtle signs that something was off, the quiet before the storm. Mrs. Henderson was taking her time selecting her usual snacks, chattering away about her grandson's recent college acceptance. Mike nodded politely, but his attention kept drifting to that SUV. His right hand unconsciously moved to his lower back, where his concealed carry permit allowed him to keep his Glock 19, a habit he'd maintained since returning to civilian life. Most of his coworkers thought he was paranoid for getting the permit, but Mike knew better. The world wasn't always as safe as small-town Pine Valley appeared to be. "You seem distracted tonight, honey," Mrs. Henderson said, placing her items on the counter. "Everything all right?" Mike forced a smile, the kind that had earned him that Pretty Boy nickname. "Just one of those nights, Mrs. H. How's that new grandbaby doing?" As he rang up her purchases, Mike noticed movement in his peripheral vision. The SUV's doors were opening, slowly and deliberately. 3 men stepped out, and even from this distance, Mike could see they were wearing hoodies pulled low over their faces. His pulse quickened, not from fear but from the familiar surge of adrenaline he knew all too well from his combat days. "Mrs. Henderson," Mike said quietly, keeping his voice steady and calm. "I think you might want to head to the back office for a moment. We're having some inventory issues I need to check on." The older woman looked confused, but something in Mike's tone made her nod without question. She'd been a nurse long enough to recognize when someone was trying to keep others safe. As she disappeared into the back office, Mike quickly locked the door behind her and moved back to his position behind the counter. The bell above the door chimed as the first man entered, followed closely by his 2 companions. They moved with the awkward confidence of amateurs trying to look professional. Nothing like the trained militants Mike had faced overseas, but dangerous nonetheless. Their hoodies were pulled tight, and each wore a bandana covering the lower half of their face. "Evening, gentlemen," Mike said pleasantly, maintaining his casual demeanor. "Anything I can help you find tonight?" The tallest of the 3 stepped forward, pulling a gun from his pocket with the kind of flourish that suggested he'd watched too many movies. "Yeah, pretty boy, you can help by emptying that register in the safe. And don't try anything stupid. We wouldn't want to mess up that perfect face of yours." The other two laughed, spreading out to flank the counter. They clearly thought they had the upper hand, 3 armed men against 1 pretty boy cashier. It was the kind of assumption that had gotten countless people killed in combat zones. Mike kept his friendly smile in place, but his mind was already running through scenarios, calculating angles, assessing threats, just as he had done countless times under Afghan skies. "Look, guys," Mike said, his voice still calm and measured, "you don't want to do this. It's not too late to walk away. The cameras have already caught your faces, and the silent alarm was triggered when you entered." This was a lie. The cameras had been broken for weeks, and the silent alarm was a fiction created by Hollywood, but they didn't need to know that. Mike watched their body language, noting the slight hesitation in their movements. The leader, however, wasn't backing down. "Shut up and open the register," he shouted, waving the gun more aggressively now. "Stop trying to be a hero, pretty boy. This isn't some movie where the handsome cashier saves the day." Mike's smile never wavered, but something changed in his eyes. A shift from friendly retail worker to something else entirely. The transformation was subtle, but it was there in the way he held himself, in the calculated stillness of his movements. What these men couldn't know was that they weren't facing a simple gas station attendant. They were standing in front of a man who had spent years in one of the most elite fighting forces in the world, who had led teams through situations far worse than this, who had been decorated for keeping his cool when everything around him was chaos. "Last chance," Mike said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of experience these would-be robbers couldn't possibly understand. "Walk away now, and we can all pretend this never happened." The leader's response was to cock his weapon, the sound echoing in the fluorescent-lit store. "No more warnings, pretty boy. Open the register now or things are about to get really ugly." The sound of the gun cocking echoed through the store, but Mike didn't flinch. Instead, his mind flashed back to his training days at Fort Benning, where he'd learned that the most dangerous moment in any confrontation was when emotions overtook reason. The leader of the trio was getting agitated, his hand trembling slightly on the weapon, a clear sign of inexperience that made him even more dangerous. "I said open it," the leader shouted, taking an aggressive step forward. His 2 companions shifted uneasily, their own weapons trained on Mike with varying degrees of uncertainty. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across their masked faces. Mike's right hand remained steady near his concealed weapon, his muscles coiled but relaxed, a state of readiness he'd perfected during countless missions. The layout of the store had suddenly transformed in his mind from a familiar workplace into a tactical environment. The chip display to his left could provide cover. The metal counter offered protection from waist down. The security mirror in the corner gave him a perfect view of the back entrance. "Look," Mike said, his voice carrying the same calm authority he'd used with new recruits in Afghanistan. "You're making a mistake here. That gun you're holding, it's a Ruger P95, right? You've got the safety on, and based on how you're gripping it, I'd say you've never fired it outside a range, if at all." The leader's eyes widened behind his mask, his grip on the weapon tightening. "How did you—" "3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 years as a combat instructor," Mike interrupted, his pretty boy smile replaced by something harder. "I've spent more time with weapons than you've spent playing video games. So let me tell you exactly what's about to happen if you don't walk away." The second robber, shorter and stockier than his leader, shifted nervously. Man, something ain't right about this guy. But the leader wasn't backing down. His wounded pride and desperation were a dangerous combination. "Shut up. He's trying to mess with our heads. He's just some pretty boy playing soldier. I bet he's never seen real action in his life." Mike's expression didn't change, but his body tensed imperceptibly. In Afghanistan, he'd learned that words could sometimes prevent violence, but he'd also learned to recognize when words weren't enough. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The leader's body language, the escalating tension in his voice, the way his finger was creeping toward the trigger, all signs pointing to imminent violence. "You know what we called guys like you in the Rangers?" Mike asked, his voice dropping lower. "We called them action movie heroes, guys who thought having a gun made them invincible. Those guys usually didn't last long in real combat." The leader's response was instant and predictable, exactly what Mike had been counting on. The gun swung up wildly, the leader's control finally snapping. "I said, shut up!" What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for Mike, though it took less than 3 seconds in real time. As the leader's gun came up, Mike was already moving. His right hand found his Glock even as his left swept the metal coffee pot from the counter, sending hot liquid spraying toward the leader's face. The movement was fluid, practiced, a combination of military training and muscle memory. The leader staggered back, momentarily blinded by the coffee. His 2 companions raised their weapons, but they were too slow, too uncertain. Mike had already cleared his weapon, his movements economical and precise. The Glock was steady in his hands, but he didn't fire. Combat experience had taught him that the threat of force was often more effective than force itself. "Drop them," Mike commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of his military authority. "You've got about 3 seconds before this gets really complicated." The 2 companions looked at each other, then at their leader who was still wiping coffee from his eyes. Their weapons clattered to the floor. The leader, finally clearing his vision, found himself staring down the barrel of Mike's Glock, held with the kind of steady precision that only comes from years of practice. "You don't look so pretty now, do you?" The leader spat, though his bravado was clearly shaken. Mike's response was calm and measured. "Pretty enough to have you 3 on the ground before you could pull those triggers. Now, face down. Hands behind your heads, Mrs. Henderson," he called out. "You can call 911 now." From the back office, the sound of a phone being dialed broke the tension. The 3 would-be robbers lay on the ground, their failed heist becoming another lesson about judging books by their covers, or in this case, judging a veteran by his looks. The wail of police sirens grew louder as red and blue lights began reflecting off the gas station's windows. Mike maintained his position, Glock trained steadily on the 3 prone figures before him. His mind was clear, focused, the same state of controlled awareness he'd maintained during countless operations overseas. The leader of the trio was still muttering curses under his breath, his earlier bravado replaced by bitter defeat. 2 police cruisers pulled into the parking lot, their headlights illuminating the scene through the store's large windows. Officer Sarah Martinez was the first through the door, her weapon drawn but lowered when she saw Mike had the situation under control. Behind her, Officer Tom Blake entered with practiced caution, quickly moving to secure the dropped weapons. Well, Martinez said, a hint of admiration in her voice as she took in the scene. "Looks like you had quite an evening, Reynolds." Mike kept his weapon trained on the suspects as the officers began handcuffing them. "Just another night at the office, Sarah. Though I have to admit, these guys made it interesting." Mrs. Henderson emerged from the back office, shaking but composed. She immediately began fussing over Mike, her nurse's instincts kicking in despite the situation. "Oh, honey, are you all right? I was so worried when I heard all that commotion." The leader of the trio, now being pulled to his feet by Officer Blake, couldn't help but make one final comment. "Should have known something was off about you, pretty boy. No regular gas station clerk moves like that." Martinez tightened the handcuffs, perhaps a bit more firmly than necessary. "That pretty boy is Sergeant Mike Reynolds, 3 tours with the 75th Ranger Regiment. You're lucky he decided to talk first and shoot later." The revelation seemed to sink in slowly for the would-be robbers. Their faces, now unmasked, showed a mixture of shock and embarrassment. The shortest one, barely out of his teens, looked like he might be sick. As the officers led the trio out to the waiting patrol cars, more vehicles began arriving. Detective James Cooper, a veteran himself, stepped into the store and immediately recognized the controlled way Mike was finally holstering his weapon. "Heard it was you, Reynolds," Cooper said, nodding appreciatively. "Want to walk me through it?" Mike began recounting the events, his report precise and detailed. another habit from his military days. He described the suspicious vehicle, his initial assessment of the threat, and the steps he'd taken to protect Mrs. Henderson and de-escalate the situation before it turned violent. Could have shot them, Mike concluded. Had clear shots at least 3 times. But they were amateurs, scared and stupid. Didn't need to end that way. Cooper nodded, understanding the unspoken sentiment. They'd both seen enough death in combat. No need to add more if it could be avoided. The next hour passed in a blur of statements, photographs, and evidence collection. The local news had gotten wind of the incident, and a reporter was already setting up outside, eager for a story about the handsome veteran who had thwarted an armed robbery. "They're calling you a hero," Mrs. Henderson said, having refused to leave until she was sure Mike was okay. "Though I always knew you were special, dear. Never understood why people around here couldn't see past your looks." Mike smiled, though his eyes remained serious. "Not a hero, Mrs. H, just did what needed to be done. Same as I did over there, same as any of us would do." As the night wore on and the excitement began to die down, Mike found himself thinking about perceptions and reality. For months he'd been content to let people see what they wanted to see. Just another pretty face, a former soldier trying to readjust to civilian life. Maybe it was easier that way, simpler to blend in and let people underestimate him. But tonight had changed things. Word would spread through Pine Valley about what had happened at Riverside Gas Station. The pretty boy label would take on a different meaning now, colored by the knowledge of who he really was and what he was capable of. Detective Cooper approached him one last time before leaving. "You know, we could use someone with your skills on the force, Reynolds. Something to think about." Mike nodded, considering the offer. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding behind the pretty boy facade. After all, he'd learned in the Rangers that true strength wasn't about appearances. It was about being ready to step up when needed, about using whatever talents you had to protect others. The sun was beginning to rise as Mike finally finished helping the crime scene technicians with their last questions. A new day was dawning, and with it, a new chapter in his life. The pretty boy of Pine Valley had revealed his true nature, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The morning after the incident at Riverside Gas Station dawned crisp and clear, but Pine Valley had already begun buzzing with news of the previous night's events. The local paper's headline read, "Former Army Ranger Thwarts Armed Robbery," complete with Mike's photo from his military days, a sharp contrast to the perfectly styled appearance the town had grown accustomed to. Mike sat in his small apartment above the local hardware store, scrolling through the countless messages on his phone. Friends from his unit had somehow gotten wind of the story and were flooding him with texts, a mixture of praise and good-natured ribbing about his pretty boy reputation. Even his former commanding officer had reached out, simply writing, "Still got it. Soldier." The sound of excited chatter from the street below drew his attention to the window. A small crowd had gathered outside the diner across the street, their animated gestures suggesting they were discussing last night's events. Mike watched them for a moment, remembering similar scenes in Afghan villages after successful operations, people gathering, sharing stories, trying to make sense of unexpected events. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Detective Cooper. "Think about what we discussed. Department could use someone like you. Coffee at Joe's? 10 a.m. Mike considered the offer. The gas station job had been a way to ease back into civilian life, a quiet position where he could process his experiences and figure out his next move. But last night had awakened something in him, a reminder of who he really was beneath the carefully maintained exterior. At precisely 10 a.m., Mike pushed open the door to Joe's diner, immediately spotting Cooper in a corner booth. The detective wasn't alone. Officer Martinez sat beside him, both of them nursing cups of coffee. "Morning, Hollywood," Martinez greeted him with a grin, using the new nickname that had apparently replaced Pretty Boy among the local law enforcement. The diner fell unusually quiet as Mike made his way to their table. He could feel the other patrons' eyes on him, their perceptions shifting and adjusting, Yesterday, he had been the handsome gas station attendant who made their coffee and smiled at their jokes. Today, he was something else entirely. "Three guys you stopped last night," Cooper began as Mike slid into the booth. "They're talking. Turns out they're connected to a string of armed robberies across 3 counties. Small-time stuff, but getting bolder. You may have prevented something worse down the line." Mike nodded, accepting the coffee the waitress brought without being asked. They were amateurs. Dangerous ones, but amateurs. Could tell by the way they moved, the way they held their weapons. "That's exactly why we need you," Martinez interjected. "That kind of experience, that instinct, it's not something you can teach at the academy." Cooper pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Inside was an application for the police academy, already partially filled out. "Fast-track program for veterans with your qualifications. Could have you on the force in half the usual time." Mike studied the application, his mind drifting back to his time in Afghanistan. He'd joined the Rangers seeking purpose, wanting to make a difference. Maybe it was time to find that purpose again, just closer to home. "Town's changing," Cooper continued, watching Mike's expression carefully. "We're getting more spillover from the city, drug problems, organized crime trying to establish footholds. We need people who can see trouble coming before it hits." The diner's door chimed, and Mrs. Henderson walked in. She immediately made her way to their table, her nurse's uniform crisp and clean despite her night shift. "Just finished my shift," she said, patting Mike's shoulder. "Had to tell everyone at the hospital about my hero. Though I suspect they've all heard by now, you're quite the talk of the town, young man." Mike shifted uncomfortably at the word hero. "Just did what needed to be done, Mrs. H. Nothing heroic about it." "That's exactly what makes it heroic," Martinez said quietly. "Knowing what needs to be done and doing it, regardless of the risk, whether it's in Afghanistan or a gas station in Pine Valley." Mrs. Henderson nodded in agreement before heading to her usual table, leaving Mike to consider the weight of their words. The application seemed to stare up at him from the table, offering a path forward. "You've been hiding," Cooper said finally, his voice low and understanding. "Using those looks of yours as a shield, letting people see what they expect to see. Maybe it's time to stop hiding." Mike ran a finger along the edge of the application, thinking about the previous night. The familiar clarity of purpose he'd felt. The satisfaction of protecting others. He thought about his time in the Rangers, about the men and women he'd served with, about the commitment they'd shared to something larger than themselves. "Something my old commander used to say," Mike said, reaching for a pen. "Sometimes the hardest part of being a soldier isn't the fighting, it's knowing when to keep fighting, just on a different battlefield." Cooper smiled as Mike began filling out the application. Outside, Pine Valley continued its morning routine, unaware that its pretty boy was about to transform from a gas station attendant into something he'd always been beneath the surface: a protector, a warrior, a guardian of his community. Before we continue, please consider subscribing to our channel to support more stories about brave veterans who continue serving their communities. Now, let's return to Mike's journey. 6 months had passed since the attempted robbery at Riverside Gas Station. The police academy had been both familiar and strange to Mike, the discipline and physical training reminiscent of his military days, but the context entirely different. His classmates had initially seen him as the pretty boy who'd gotten lucky at the gas station, but that perception hadn't lasted long. During firearms training, Mike had demonstrated the kind of precision that only comes from years of combat experience. In tactical scenarios, his instincts and decision-making had impressed even the most seasoned instructors. The same skills that had kept him alive in Afghanistan were now being refined for a new purpose. Today was graduation day. Mike stood before the mirror in his apartment, adjusting his new police uniform. The brass badge caught the morning light, reflecting it back at him, like a promise. His phone buzzed with a text from Martinez. "Ready, Hollywood?" Big crowd out here. The graduation ceremony was being held in the Pine Valley Community Center, and it seemed like half the town had turned out. Mike spotted Mrs. Henderson in the front row, beaming with pride. Detective Cooper stood at the back, arms crossed, a satisfied smile on his face. Even some of the regular customers from his gas station days had come to show their support. As Police Chief Roberts called each graduate forward, Mike reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The gas station robbery had been more than just an incident. It had been a wake-up call, a reminder that you can't outrun who you are, even if you try to hide it behind a pretty face. "Officer Michael Reynolds," Chief Roberts announced, and Mike stepped forward to receive his badge and certificate. The applause was thunderous, but Mike's focus was drawn to a group of men standing along the back wall, fellow veterans he recognized from around town. They weren't cheering or clapping, just standing tall, offering silent nods of approval. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, what this moment really meant. After the ceremony, as people mingled and celebrated, Detective Cooper pulled Mike aside. "Remember those 3 from the gas station? Their trial's next week. DA's office thinks they might be willing to flip on some bigger players in exchange for lighter sentences." Mike nodded, understanding the implications. The robbery wasn't random, was it? "We think they were testing the waters, seeing how soft the targets were in our area. Your little demonstration that night sent a pretty clear message." Cooper grinned. "Not as soft as they thought." Mrs. Henderson appeared suddenly, wrapping Mike in a tight hug. "Oh, look at you! From my favorite coffee server to Officer Reynolds, though I must say the uniform suits you even better than that gas station apron." Mike laughed, but his attention was caught by a familiar face in the crowd. Sarah, one of the regular customers from his gas station days. She'd been one of the most vocal about his pretty boy appearance, often making comments about how he belonged on a magazine cover rather than behind a counter. "Officer Reynolds," she said, approaching with a slightly embarrassed smile. I owe you an apology. I never took the time to see past the surface, never bothered to understand that there might be more to you than just looks." Mike shook his head. "No apology needed. We all wear masks sometimes. What matters is being ready to take them off when it counts." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of congratulations and well wishes. As the crowd began to thin, Chief Roberts approached Mike with his first assignment, patrol duty, starting tomorrow morning. "Ready to protect and serve, Officer Reynolds?" the chief asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Mike thought about the gas station, about Afghanistan, about all the moments that had led him here. "Been doing it all my life, sir, just wearing a different uniform now." As the sun set over Pine Valley, Mike drove home in his personal car for the last time. Tomorrow he'd be in a patrol vehicle. The town looked different somehow, or maybe he was seeing it through new eyes. The streets he'd once viewed as a civilian now represented his responsibility, his duty. His phone buzzed one last time, a message from his old commanding officer. "Once a guardian, always a guardian. Just changing battlefields, soldier. Make us proud." Mike smiled, thinking about how far he'd come from being the pretty boy at the gas station. Appearances could be deceiving, but purpose was something that couldn't be hidden forever. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve, and Mike Reynolds, former Army Ranger, former gas station attendant, and now police officer, was ready to face them all. The pretty boy of Pine Valley had finally found his true calling, and it had nothing to do with looks and everything to do with service. Officer Mike Reynolds' first week on the force proved that Pine Valley wasn't quite as quiet as it appeared on the surface. His patrol route took him through both the sleepy residential neighborhoods and the increasingly troubled areas near the highway, where the city's influence was slowly creeping in. On this particular morning, Mike was parked in his cruiser, monitoring traffic near the same gas station where everything had changed 6 months ago. The new attendant, a college student named Tommy, waved at him through the window. The store had installed better security systems since the attempted robbery, but Mike still found himself checking on it during his shifts. A radio crackled to life. "All units be advised. Suspects from the Harrison Street drug bust may be in the area. Black SUV, tinted windows, last seen heading west on Route 75. Mike's hand instinctively moved to his weapon as he scanned the highway. This wasn't the first time he'd heard about the Harrison Street case. Over the past few months, a new drug operation had been trying to establish itself in Pine Valley, using the town's peaceful reputation as cover. Copy that, dispatch. Unit 217 monitoring Highway 75 near Riverside Gas, Mike responded, his military training kicking in as he observed each vehicle passing by with calculated precision. Detective Cooper had briefed him about the Harrison Street situation earlier in the week. The operation was more sophisticated than the usual small-town drug deals. They had connections to larger criminal organizations in the city, and they were getting bolder. A black SUV caught Mike's attention as it exited the highway. The vehicle matched the description, but something else triggered his combat-honed instincts. The way it moved, slightly too careful, too deliberate. The driver was trying too hard to appear normal. Dispatch. Possible visual on suspect vehicle. Following at safe distance, requesting backup. The SUV turned onto Cedar Lane, a quiet street lined with small businesses. Mike maintained his distance, years of surveillance experience in Afghanistan guiding his actions. The vehicle suddenly accelerated, taking a sharp turn into an abandoned warehouse parking lot. Suspects are moving to the old Miller warehouse. They may have made my unit, Mike reported, his voice calm despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. The warehouse had been empty for years, its deteriorating structure a testament to Pine Valley's changing economy. As Mike pulled up, he saw 3 men scrambling out of the SUV carrying duffel bags. They disappeared into the building just as backup units could be heard in the distance. Officer Martinez's voice came through the radio. Unit 217, backup is 4 minutes out. Hold position and wait for... A burst of gunfire interrupted her transmission, bullets pinging off the cruiser's hood. Mike was already moving, his body responding with the fluid efficiency that had kept him alive in countless firefights overseas. Shots fired! Shots fired! Suspects are armed and hostile, he reported, taking cover behind his vehicle. I have civilians in the adjacent buildings. Cannot wait for backup. The situation was escalating quickly. Through the warehouse's broken windows, Mike could see the suspects setting up defensive positions. They were better organized than common criminals. Their movements suggested military or tactical training. "Pretty boy cop," one of them shouted. "Remember me should have killed us at the gas station when you had the chance." Mike recognized the voice, the leader from the attempted robbery. He'd made bail 2 days ago, and now here he was, involved in something much bigger. More shots rang out, and Mike heard the sound of breaking glass from the furniture store next door. Civilians were at risk, and backup was still minutes away. He had to act. The warehouse had a layout similar to buildings he'd cleared in Afghanistan. Main floor, upper catwalk, multiple entry points. While the suspects focused their attention on his cruiser, Mike moved silently around the building's perimeter, accessing a side entrance he'd noticed during previous patrols. Inside, the warehouse was dim and dusty. Mike moved like a shadow, his footsteps silent on the concrete floor. He could hear the suspects arguing above him on the catwalk. "Police units are coming, we gotta move." "Shut up. We take care of the pretty boy first, then we're gone." Mike smiled grimly in the darkness. They were still underestimating him, still seeing only what they wanted to see. Some lessons had to be learned the hard way. Using the warehouse's support columns as cover, he worked his way closer. The suspects were so focused on the front entrance that they didn't notice him ascending the metal stairs to the catwalk, moving with the same precision he'd used on countless missions. "Police, drop your weapons!" Mike's voice boomed through the warehouse, his weapon trained on the suspects before they could fully turn around. The leader's eyes widened in recognition and fear. Once again, he'd misread the situation, underestimated the man behind the pretty face. This time, though, the consequences would be much more severe. Sirens wailed in the distance as backup approached, but inside the warehouse, the situation was already under control. The pretty boy cop had once again proved that appearances could be deceiving, especially in Pine Valley. The warehouse incident made headlines across the state, transforming Mike from a local hero into something of a regional legend. Pretty boy cop takes down drug ring ran the city papers, while Pine Valley's local gazette went with former ranger proves looks can kill. Mike ignored the publicity, focusing instead on the larger implications of what they'd uncovered. The suspects had rolled over quickly under questioning, revealing connections to a major drug trafficking operation that had been trying to establish routes through small towns like Pine Valley. The leader of the gas station robbery, now facing multiple felony charges, seemed eager to make a deal. "You don't get it," he told Detective Cooper during interrogation, while Mike watched through the one-way glass. "We were supposed to be testing the waters, seeing how tough these small towns were. That pretty boy at the gas station? He wasn't supposed to fight back. None of this was supposed to happen." Mike stood in silence, remembering similar interrogations in Afghanistan. The way small pieces of intelligence could reveal larger patterns of operation. The attempted robbery, the drug running, the warehouse shootout. They were all connected, part of a bigger picture that was slowly coming into focus. Chief Roberts called a special meeting the next morning, gathering the department's key personnel in the briefing room. Maps and photographs covered the walls, showing the various incidents that had plagued the region over the past year. "Thanks to Officer Reynolds' actions," the chief began, "we've confirmed what we've suspected. Criminal organizations from the city are expanding, using veterans and ex-military personnel to train their operatives. They're targeting small towns, thinking we're easy marks." Mike studied the pattern of incidents on the map. "They're using military tactics, sir. The warehouse team had training. You could see it in their movements, their weapons handling. They're recruiting guys who served." Martinez nodded from her seat. "Makes sense. Who better to help them take over small towns than people who've been trained in tactical operations?" The revelation hit close to home for Mike. He thought about his fellow veterans, about how easy it would be for some of them to be drawn into this life. The skills they'd learned serving their country were valuable, and not everyone found a positive way to use them after coming home. "We've got a bigger problem," Cooper added, tossing a file onto the table. "Word about the warehouse incident is spreading. Our pretty boy cop here has gotten their attention. They're not happy about losing their test team." Mike picked up the file, examining surveillance photos of known gang members from the city. His military training kicked in as he analyzed their operations, their patterns, their weaknesses. This was a different kind of war, but the principles were the same. "Let them come," Mike said quietly, his voice carrying the same calm confidence he'd had in combat. They thought Pine Valley would be an easy target. Time to show them why they're wrong. After the meeting, Mike drove through town on his patrol route, seeing everything through new eyes. The quiet streets, the friendly faces, the peaceful community, it all needed protection, now more than ever. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Henderson. "Saw the news, honey. Be careful out there." He smiled, remembering that night at the gas station. He'd been hiding then, using his looks as a shield, trying to blend into civilian life. But sometimes life had other plans, pushing you toward your true purpose whether you were ready or not. The radio crackled with routine calls. A fender bender on Main Street, a noise complaint from the high school, a shoplifter at the drugstore. Normal everyday problems that seemed almost quaint compared to what they were facing. But Mike handled each call with the same dedication, understanding that every interaction with the community built trust, strengthened bonds, prepared them for whatever was coming. As the sun set over Pine Valley, Mike parked his cruiser near the park, watching families enjoy the last warm days of autumn. A group of veterans from the local VFW approached, led by old Jim Harper, who'd served in Vietnam. "Heard about what happened at the warehouse," Jim said, leaning against the cruiser. "About them recruiting veterans for their operation. Wanted you to know we're spreading the word, keeping an eye out for our own." Mike nodded, grateful for the support. The veteran community was tight-knit, looking out for each other even years after serving. It was another layer of protection for the town, another reason Pine Valley wouldn't be an easy target. "They thought this would be simple," Mike said, watching children play on the swings. "They saw small towns, pretty faces, easy marks. They forgot that sometimes the toughest soldiers are the ones who don't need to show it." Jim smiled, understanding in his eyes. "Keep up the good work, pretty boy. Show them what a small-town cop with ranger training can do." The nickname had stuck, but it had taken on a different meaning now. In Pine Valley, "pretty boy" was no longer a dismissal or a joke. It was a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and that sometimes the most dangerous opponents were the ones you underestimated. The threats against Pine Valley intensified over the next few weeks. Reports of suspicious vehicles increased, and unknown faces began appearing in town with greater frequency. Mike and his fellow officers maintained heightened patrols, knowing that the criminal organization from the city wouldn't take their recent losses lightly. One evening, while Mike was reviewing case files in his apartment, Detective Cooper arrived with new intelligence. "They're planning something big," he said, spreading photographs across Mike's kitchen table. "Our informants in the city say they're tired of being embarrassed by a pretty boy cop in some small town." The photos showed several known gang members meeting with former military personnel. Mike recognized the tactical gear they were wearing, the same kind he'd used in Afghanistan. "They're building a strike team," he observed, studying their equipment. "Professional grade stuff, not street-level hardware." "That's not all," Cooper added, pulling out another file. "Remember our friend from the gas station and warehouse? He was found dead in his cell this morning, made to look like suicide, but—" Mike nodded grimly. "They're cleaning house, removing loose ends." A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Both men reached for their weapons, but it was only Mrs. Henderson, bringing her usual Thursday night casserole. She took one look at the photos spread across the table and understood the gravity of the situation. "The whole town's talking," she said, setting down the food. "People are scared. They know something's coming." Mike thought about how Pine Valley had changed since his days at the gas station. The community had grown closer, more vigilant. Veterans from the VFW patrolled the streets in informal neighborhood watches. Local business owners had installed better security systems. The town was preparing for a storm. "We're not going to wait for them to hit us," Mike said, an idea forming in his mind. "We're going to set the battlefield." Over the next few days, Mike worked with the department to implement his plan. His military experience had taught him that superior numbers and equipment could be countered with proper preparation and tactical advantage. Pine Valley might be small, but it was their territory. They converted the old warehouse district into a surveillance zone, installing hidden cameras and motion sensors. Local veterans helped identify defensive positions and potential ambush points. The community came together, sharing information about suspicious activities and unfamiliar vehicles. "You've turned the whole town into a tactical operation," Martinez remarked during their patrol briefing. "Just like in the military?" Mike smiled, remembering similar preparations in Afghan villages. "Sometimes the best defense is making your enemy fight on your terms." The warning came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. One of Jim Harper's VFW members spotted several unmarked vans entering town from different directions. Mike was at the station when the call came in. "This is it," he told Chief Roberts. "They're trying to overwhelm us with multiple teams." The chief nodded, trusting Mike's assessment. "How do you want to play it?" "Let them come in," Mike said, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a combat veteran. "Let them think they have the advantage. Then we show them what a prepared community can do." As darkness fell over Pine Valley, the town appeared quiet and vulnerable. But behind closed doors and darkened windows, citizens stayed alert, reporting movements through a carefully organized communication network. Veterans took up predetermined observation posts, their military training once again serving their community. Mike positioned himself near the old gas station, now a crucial crossroads in their defensive plan. He touched his badge, remembering how this had all started: a supposedly easy target, a pretty face behind a counter, a series of bad assumptions. "Multiple vehicles approaching from the south," crackled his radio. "Heavy tactical gear, just like you said." "Remember," Mike broadcast to all units, "we're not just protecting a town, we're sending a message. Small towns aren't easy targets anymore." The first van appeared at the intersection, Moving slowly past the gas station, Mike could see the tactical gear through the tinted windows, the professional way they scanned their surroundings. They were good, but they had made one crucial mistake. They still thought they were hunting a pretty boy cop in a small town. They hadn't realized they were walking into a trap set by a ranger who had turned his whole community into a coordinated defensive force. "All units in position," Martinez confirmed over the radio. Mike touched his weapon, feeling the familiar calm of combat settling over him. Pine Valley might have seen him as just a pretty face once, but tonight, everyone would see something different. Tonight, they would see why you should never judge a warrior by his cover. "Execute," he commanded. And Pine Valley's night of reckoning began. The night erupted into controlled chaos as Pine Valley's trap was sprung. Mike watched from his position as the first van's tires shredded on carefully placed spike strips, sending the vehicle sliding to a halt near the gas station. The second and third vans, approaching from different directions, met similar fates at their designated intersections. "Teams disabled," Martinez reported through the radio. "All primary targets contained in zones A, B, and C." Mike observed the tactical team from the first van attempting to regroup. Their movements precise but predictable. They were well-trained, but they were fighting blind in unfamiliar territory. Every streetlight in the area had been strategically disabled, leaving only the dim glow of the gas station signs to illuminate the scene. "You're surrounded," Mike's voice boomed through the police cruiser's speaker system. "This is your only warning." The response was immediate and aggressive, exactly as he'd anticipated. The tactical team took up defensive positions around their disabled van, their weapons trained on visible targets while completely missing the veterans positioned in the darkness around them. "These guys are former military," Jim Harper's voice crackled through a separate radio channel. "Rangers, maybe Marines. I recognize their formation." Mike had already noticed it. Their positioning, their discipline, these weren't common criminals. They were trained soldiers who had chosen the wrong side. In another life, they might have been his brothers in arms. The first exchange of gunfire came from the south, where the second van had been disabled. The sound of controlled bursts echoed through the streets, followed by Martinez's calm report. Suspects attempting to breach the hardware store, walking right into position. Mike watched as the team near him began to advance toward the gas station, likely seeking higher ground and a better vantage point. They moved well, covering each other with practiced precision. But they didn't know that every approach had been prepared, every angle covered. "Execute Phase 2, Mike commanded. Suddenly, powerful lights blazed from concealed positions, overwhelming the tactical team's night vision equipment. In the same instant, smoke grenades deployed from preset positions, filling the street with a disorienting haze. It was a technique Mike had learned in urban warfare training, controlling the battlefield's visibility and tempo. "Police, drop your weapons." The command came from multiple directions as Pine Valley's officers and veteran volunteers revealed their positions, each covering a pre-planned sector of fire. The tactical team's leader, momentarily blinded and surrounded, made a critical error. "Push through!" he shouted. "It's just a small-town force." Mike emerged from his position, his movements fluid and deadly serious. "Small town," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of combat experience, but not an easy target. The leader's head snapped toward Mike's voice, recognition dawning in his eyes. "The pretty boy cop," he spat. "Should have known." What followed was a testament to preparation over aggression, strategy over force. The tactical team found every escape route blocked, every advantage nullified. They had come expecting to overwhelm a small-town police force but found themselves caught in a military-grade operation. "Last chance," Mike announced, his weapon trained steady. "Weapons down, hands up." One by one, the tactical team members realized their position was untenable. Their weapons clattered to the ground as similar scenes played out across town. Martinez's voice confirmed successes at the other locations. All teams contained, all threats neutralized. As Mike supervised the arrests, he noticed something familiar about the team leader, a tattoo visible on his neck, a unit insignia he recognized. 75th Ranger Regiment, Mike said quietly. When did you serve? The leader's defiant expression flickered. Afghanistan, 2012. We might have passed each other there, Mike replied, securing the man's handcuffs. Fought the same battles, protected the same people. And now here we are. Yeah, the leader laughed bitterly. The pretty boy and the sellout. Funny how things turn out. Dawn was breaking over Pine Valley as the last of the suspects were processed. The town had been defended not just by its police force, but by its entire community. Veterans, civilians, and officers had worked together, turning their small town into an impenetrable fortress. Chief Roberts surveyed the scene, shaking his head in amazement. They came expecting an easy target. Found an army instead. Mike watched as Mrs. Henderson emerged from her hiding spot in the gas station, where she'd been coordinating civilian communications throughout the operation. The town had changed, he realized. They all had. Not an army, Mike corrected, holstering his weapon. A community that learned not to judge by appearances, whether it's a pretty boy behind a counter or a small town on a map. The sun rose fully over Pine Valley, illuminating a town that would never again be seen as an easy target. Sometimes the most important battles weren't won with superior force, but with the power of underestimation and the strength of a community united. The aftermath of Pine Valley's night of reckoning rippled through the region like shockwaves. State police and FBI agents descended on the town, processing evidence and interviewing suspects. The story of how a small community, led by a former Army Ranger turned police officer, had outmaneuvered and captured a professional criminal strike team made national headlines. Mike sat in Chief Roberts' office watching news coverage on the small TV mounted in the corner. Pretty boy cop leads small town to victory scrolled across the bottom of the screen, accompanied by his official police photo. You've started something here, the chief said, tossing a stack of reports onto his desk. Other towns are reaching out wanting to know how we did it. They're tired of being seen as easy targets. Mike nodded, thinking about the interrogations they'd conducted over the past few days. The captured tactical teams had revealed a widespread network of criminal organizations targeting small communities, using their perceived weaknesses against them. It's not just about security systems or tactical plans, Mike replied. It's about changing how these towns see themselves, building community, utilizing everyone's strengths. Detective Cooper entered the office carrying fresh coffee and more files. Speaking of strengths, our friends from the FBI are particularly interested in your military background. They're talking about using Pine Valley as a model for other communities. The idea made sense to Mike. Every town had veterans, people with valuable skills and experience. They just needed direction, purpose, a way to continue serving their communities. Mrs. Henderson knocked on the office door, bringing her signature casserole for the officers working overtime. The diner's full of reporters, she reported. Everyone wants to know about our pretty boy hero and his veteran army. Mike smiled at the nickname that wouldn't die. Not a hero, Mrs. H. Just someone who learned that appearances don't define capability. The days that followed brought changes to Pine Valley. The police department established a community defense program, integrating veteran skills with civilian volunteers. Jim Harper and his VFW members became official security consultants, their military experience finally finding a new purpose. You know what the best part is? Martinez said during their patrol briefing. The city gangs are avoiding us now. Word spread that Pine Valley's not worth the trouble. Mike watched new recruits, both police and civilian volunteers, training at the converted warehouse. Former soldiers taught tactical awareness to shopkeepers. Nurses like Mrs. Henderson organized emergency response teams. The whole town had transformed into a model of community defense. One evening, as Mike finished his shift, he stopped by the gas station where everything had started. Tommy, the college student attendant, was proudly showing off the new security systems to a reporter. Officer Reynolds taught us it's not about having the most expensive equipment, Tommy explained. It's about awareness, communication, working together. The reporter turned to Mike as he entered. Officer Reynolds, people are calling this the Pine Valley Protocol, small towns taking back control from criminal organizations. What's your response to becoming a national model? Mike bought his coffee, thinking about how far they'd come from the night when 3 amateur robbers thought they could take advantage of a pretty face behind a counter. It's not about me, he said finally. It's about communities realizing that they're stronger than they think, that sometimes the best defense is letting your opponents underestimate you. Later that night, Mike received a call from his old commanding officer. Saw you on the news, Reynolds. Still leading troops, just on a different battlefield. Different battlefield, same principle, Mike replied. Never judge a book by its cover. The commander laughed. You always did use those looks of yours to tactical advantage. Remember that reconnaissance mission where you played the lost tourist? They shared memories for a while, but the conversation turned serious. Other veterans are asking about what you've done there, the commander said. They want to know how they can do the same in their towns. Mike looked out his apartment window at the peaceful streets of Pine Valley. The town had changed, grown stronger, more confident. The pretty boy gas station attendant had become something more, but so had the entire community. Tell them it starts with stopping the act, Mike said. Whether you're hiding behind a pretty face or a tough guy facade. Tell them it's about using everything you are to protect what matters. As he ended the call, Mike saw his reflection in the window, the same face that had earned him the pretty boy nickname, now wearing the badge of a protector, a leader, a guardian of his community. Pine Valley had learned its lesson about appearances, and thanks to their example, other towns would too. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't strength or tactical gear or even combat experience. It's being underestimated by those who never bothered to look beneath the surface. The pretty boy cop had changed more than just his own story. He'd helped create a new chapter in the story of small-town America, where being underestimated wasn't a weakness, but a strength waiting to be unleashed. 1 month after the failed attack on Pine Valley, Mike found himself standing in front of a packed conference room at the State Police Academy. Law enforcement officers and community leaders from across the country had gathered to learn about what the media was calling the Pine Valley Protocol. It's not just about tactical response, Mike explained, gesturing to the diagrams displayed behind him. It's about changing how criminals see small towns. Every community has its own unique strengths, veterans, medical professionals, business owners. The key is bringing them together, making them part of the solution. In the audience, he spotted familiar faces. Mrs. Henderson had been invited to speak about organizing civilian support networks. Jim Harper was there to discuss integrating veteran expertise into community defense. Even Tommy from the gas station had come to share his perspective on business security. 3 months ago, I was just the pretty boy working nights at a gas station, Mike continued, earning knowing chuckles from the crowd. The criminals who tried to rob that store saw what they wanted to see, an easy target. They didn't bother looking deeper, and that was their mistake. Detective Cooper, standing at the back of the room, nodded in agreement. The Pine Valley case had become required reading at police academies across the state. The model they'd developed was being implemented in dozens of small towns. After the presentation, a young officer from another small town approached Mike. "We've got the same problem," she said. "Criminals think we're soft targets because we're small. How do you change that mindset?" "You start by changing how you see yourselves," Mike replied. "Every small town has hidden strengths. Sometimes the best defense is letting your opponents underestimate you while quietly building your capabilities." The conference had drawn attention from unexpected quarters. Federal agencies were studying the Pine Valley incident, particularly interested in how a small police force had outmaneuvered professionally trained tactical teams. During the lunch break, Mike received a call from Martinez back in Pine Valley. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Remember those guys we caught? Turns out they were just one cell of a larger network. The FBI's using our intel to track down similar operations across the country. Mike wasn't surprised. He'd seen similar patterns in Afghanistan, how taking down one element often revealed connections to larger networks. The criminal organizations targeting small towns were no different. "How's the town?" he asked, missing his regular patrol route. "Quiet," Martinez replied. "Word's gotten around. Nobody wants to mess with the town that took down a professional strike team, though people still ask about their pretty boy hero." Mike laughed at the persistent nickname. It had become something of a running joke in law enforcement circles, the pretty boy cop who turned the tables on organized crime. Later that afternoon, Mike led a tactical workshop, demonstrating how Pine Valley had transformed everyday locations into strategic assets. The old warehouse district, the gas station, the network of local businesses, each had played a crucial role in the town's defense. "Your greatest advantage is local knowledge," he explained. "Criminals might have better equipment or more personnel, but they don't know your territory like you do. Use that." As the conference wound down, Chief Roberts pulled Mike aside. "The FBI's putting together a task force," he said. "They want you to consult on implementing this program in other communities." Mike considered the offer. He thought about his journey from gas station attendant to local cop to potentially helping protect small towns across the country. Each step had been guided by the same principle, using others' underestimation to tactical advantage. "Tell them I'll help," Mike decided, "but I'm staying in Pine Valley. Everything we've accomplished here started because a pretty boy behind a counter surprised some would-be robbers. I'm not done protecting my town." That evening, as Mike drove back to Pine Valley, he reflected on how much had changed. The town had become a symbol of resistance against criminal exploitation of small communities. The pretty boy cop had become a model for others to follow. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Henderson. "Hurry back, honey. The diner's planning a welcome home party. The whole town's talking about their famous son." Mike smiled, thinking about the community that had come together to protect itself. The gas station where it all started was now a local landmark, complete with a small plaque commemorating the night when a pretty face proved to be more than meets the eye. Pine Valley had changed, but its greatest transformation wasn't in its security systems or tactical preparations. It was in how the town saw itself, not as a vulnerable small community, but as a united force capable of defending itself against any threat. The pretty boy cop had helped spark that change, but the real story was about something bigger. It was about small towns everywhere learning that sometimes their greatest strength lay in being underestimated. Back in Pine Valley, Mike's return brought a new set of challenges. The town's success had painted a target on their back, not from criminals this time, but from media attention and the weight of their own reputation. News vans had become a common sight on Main Street, reporters eager to tell the story of the small town that fought back. "We've got another interview request," Martinez announced during morning briefing. "National Magazine wants to do a feature on the pretty boy protector of Pine Valley." "Their words, not mine." Mike shook his head, focusing instead on the crime statistics in front of him. Since implementing their community defense program, reported incidents had dropped by 70%. Other numbers were more interesting. Veteran involvement in community programs was up. Local business participation had doubled, and neighboring towns were starting to adopt similar measures. "Let them run their stories," Mike replied, "as long as it helps other communities realize they don't have to be victims." The FBI task force was making progress, using Pine Valley's model to identify and disrupt criminal networks targeting small towns. Mike's consulting work had helped establish similar programs in 3 neighboring counties, each adapting the protocol to their specific needs. Chief Roberts called Mike into his office later that day. "Got something interesting?" he said, sliding a file across his desk. "Remember those tactical teams we caught? One of them wants to talk. Says he has information about who's really behind these operations." The interview was scheduled for the state prison where the former tactical team member was being held. Mike made the drive, thinking about how paths could diverge. Both he and the prisoner had been rangers, had served their country. Somewhere along the line, their roads had split. "Didn't expect you to be the one to take us down," the prisoner admitted when Mike sat down. "Looking at you, all we saw was some pretty boy playing cop. Should have known better. Rangers never stop being Rangers." Mike leaned forward. "Why are you talking now?" "Because you proved something," the man replied. "Showed us that small towns aren't easy targets anymore. Made me remember why I wore the uniform in the first place." The intelligence he provided was valuable: names, locations, operational details about the criminal networks targeting rural communities. But more important was the insight into their mindset, how they selected targets, and why they consistently underestimated small-town defenses. Driving back to Pine Valley, Mike stopped at the gas station where everything had started. Tommy was working the register, now confidently operating the new security systems installed after the attempted robbery. "Officer Reynolds," Tommy grinned. "You see the new security cameras? Jim's been teaching us about maintaining proper surveillance zones." Mike bought his usual coffee, noting how the simple gas station had become a symbol of the town's transformation. The place where a pretty face behind a counter had surprised 3 would-be robbers, setting off a chain of events that would change how small towns protected themselves. Back at the station, Mrs. Henderson was organizing the civilian response team's weekly meeting. The group had grown, now including representatives from every major business and community organization in town. "There's my favorite pretty boy protector," she called out. "We're planning emergency response drills for next month. The hospital's fully on board this time." The nickname had evolved, becoming less about appearance and more about the lesson it represented: the danger of judging capability by appearance alone. Pine Valley had learned that lesson well. Later that evening, Mike joined Jim Harper and some other veterans at the VFW hall. They were reviewing applications from other towns requesting help setting up similar programs. "Never thought I'd be useful again," Jim admitted. "After Vietnam, felt like my experience didn't matter anymore. Now look at us, teaching others how to protect their communities." Mike understood. Every veteran in the room had found new purpose in the program, their military experience finally finding practical application in civilian life. As night fell over Pine Valley, Mike patrolled the quiet streets, remembering the night when 3 amateur robbers had walked into the gas station, expecting to find an easy target. Instead, they'd found a ranger, triggering a sequence of events that would reshape how small towns viewed themselves. His radio crackled with routine calls. A noise complaint? A minor traffic accident? The normal piece of small-town life. But beneath that peace was a new strength, a quiet readiness that hadn't existed before. The pretty boy cop had become something more, just as Pine Valley had become more than just another small town. They had become an example, a model for others to follow, proof that sometimes the most effective defense is allowing others to underestimate you. Mike smiled as he continued his patrol, knowing that somewhere out there another small town was learning the same lesson, that appearances can be deceiving, and that true strength often lies in being underestimated. 6 months into implementing the Pine Valley Protocol across multiple communities, a new threat emerged that would test everything Mike and his town had built. It started with a series of encrypted messages intercepted by the FBI task force, communications suggesting that a major criminal organization was planning to make an example of Pine Valley. "They're calling us an infection," Detective Cooper explained during an emergency briefing. "Say we're spreading, teaching other towns to resist. They want to make Pine Valley a warning to others." Mike studied the intelligence reports, recognizing the tactical sophistication behind the threats. This wasn't just another criminal gang. This was an organization with military-grade resources and training. "They'll try to hit us hard," Mike assessed, his combat experience reading between the lines. "Make it public. Make it hurt. Show other towns what happens when you fight back." Chief Roberts nodded grimly. "FBI wants to send in a protective detail, set up a perimeter around the town." "No," Mike said firmly, surprising everyone in the room. "That's exactly what they want, to make us look weak, dependent on outside protection. We defend ourselves, show everyone that the protocol works." Martinez leaned forward, studying the tactical maps they'd developed. They'll be expecting that too. They've studied us. Know our methods. Good, Mike smiled. His pretty boy looks masking the tactical mind beneath. Let them think they know everything about us. That's always been our advantage. Over the next week, Pine Valley quietly prepared. But unlike their previous defensive operations, this time they did something different. They made it visible. Let their opponents see exactly what they were planning. It's like that mission in Kandahar, Mike explained to Jim Harper, as they deliberately positioned security cameras and motion sensors in obvious locations. Sometimes the best way to hide your real defense is to show them exactly what they expect to see. Mrs. Henderson's civilian network spread carefully crafted rumors about police reinforcements and FBI presence, while actually organizing a more subtle response network. Local businesses installed obvious security upgrades while quietly implementing more sophisticated measures. They'll be watching us, Mike briefed the community leaders. They'll see exactly what they expect, a small town scrambling to protect itself in obvious ways. What they won't see is what we're really preparing. The town's veterans added another layer to the deception, running visible training exercises while secretly positioning themselves in less obvious defensive positions. Every obvious security measure had a hidden counterpart. Just like the pretty boy behind the counter, Martinez commented during a planning session. Let them see what they expect to see. The waiting game lasted 2 weeks. Surveillance spotted multiple reconnaissance teams watching the town, documenting their defensive preparations. Each time, Pine Valley made sure they saw exactly what they wanted to see. They're getting confident, Cooper reported after intercepting more communications. Think they got us figured out. Planning something big for next week. Mike gathered the town's key defenders in the converted warehouse that had become their command center. The space had been transformed, not just into a tactical operations center, but into a symbol of the town's resilience. Remember when this started? Mike addressed the group. They thought a pretty face meant an easy target. Now they think visible defenses mean they know our capabilities. Same mistake, different scale. Tommy from the gas station raised his hand. Just like the robbery, right? They'll be expecting one thing but get another. Exactly, Mike confirmed. Every obvious camera has a hidden one. Every visible defensive position masks 3 others. Every public security measure has a private counterpart. The town's transformation was complete, but not in the way their opponents thought. Pine Valley hadn't just become stronger. It had learned to use others' expectations as a weapon. As the deadline approached, Mike stood in front of the gas station where everything had begun, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Mrs. Henderson brought him his usual coffee. Nervous, pretty boy? She asked, using the nickname that had become a symbol of their strategy. Mike smiled, thinking about how far they'd come from the night when 3 robbers thought they had found an easy target. They see what they expect to see, a small town trying to protect itself with obvious measures, just like they once saw a pretty face and thought they knew what they were dealing with. The pretty boy cop had taught Pine Valley its most valuable lesson, that sometimes your greatest strength lies in letting others underestimate you. Now, as a new threat approached, the town was ready to teach that lesson again. Martinez's voice crackled over his radio. Multiple vehicles spotted on approach routes. Looks like they're right on schedule. Mike touched his badge, then checked his weapon. Let them come. Sometimes the pretty face is exactly what you want them to see. Pine Valley settled into silent readiness, preparing to once again prove that appearances can be deceiving, especially in a small town that had mastered the art of being underestimated. The attack on Pine Valley began exactly as Mike had predicted. Multiple teams converged on the town simultaneously, their movements precise and coordinated. They targeted the obvious defensive positions first, just as planned, finding them surprisingly easy to overcome. All units hold position, Mike commanded through the secure radio channel. Let them think it's working. From his concealed position near the gas station, Mike watched the first team move through the town's outer perimeter. They were good, better than the previous tactical teams they'd faced. Their movements showed extensive military training, their equipment top of the line. "West sector breached," Martinez reported calmly. "They're following the exact path we laid out." The attackers moved with growing confidence, systematically dismantling the visible security measures Pine Valley had put in place. Each easy victory reinforced their assumption that they had the upper hand. "You're right about their training," Jim Harper's voice crackled through the radio. "These guys are ex-special forces. Recognize some of their hand signals." Mike watched through his rifle scope as the team leader directed his men toward the warehouse district. Just like the robbers at the gas station months ago, they were seeing exactly what they expected to see, and missing everything else. "All teams continue to hold," Mike ordered. "Let them get comfortable. Let them think they've got us figured out." Mrs. Henderson's voice came through on the civilian channel. "Emergency response teams in position. All civilians accounted for in safe zones." The attackers had split into 3 main groups, each focusing on what they believed were Pine Valley's critical defensive points. They moved past hidden observation posts, unknowingly walking into pre-planned containment zones. "Remember," Mike broadcast to all channels, "they think they know what they're dealing with, just like they once thought they knew what a pretty boy behind a counter was capable of." The first sign that something was wrong came when the attackers tried to breach the warehouse district. Their communications suddenly went dark, jammed by equipment hidden in seemingly abandoned buildings. The easy targets they'd overcome had drawn them exactly where Pine Valley wanted them. "Phase 2, Mike commanded. "Show them what they missed." The town's true defensive network activated. Hidden barriers rose from the streets, cutting off escape routes. Concealed lighting systems activated, disrupting night vision equipment. Veterans in camouflaged positions revealed themselves, covering every angle. "What the hell?" one of the attackers shouted, his voice carrying through the night. "This isn't what our intel showed." Mike stepped out from his position, his weapon trained steady. "Intelligence is only as good as your assumptions," he called out. "You saw what you expected to see." The attackers found themselves caught in overlapping fields of fire, their careful planning undone by their own confidence. Every route they'd mapped, every weakness they'd identified, had been a carefully crafted illusion. "Pretty boy cop," the team leader spat, recognizing Mike. "Should have known. You set this up from the start." "You made the same mistake others made," Mike replied. "Saw the surface, missed everything beneath it. Pine Valley isn't just another small town anymore." The fighting was brief but intense. The attackers were skilled, but they were caught in a trap years of military experience had helped design. Every attempt to regroup or counterattack had been anticipated and prepared for. "All sectors reporting," Martinez announced. "Targets contained, no civilian casualties." As police units moved in to secure the captured attackers, Mike noticed something familiar about their leader's bearing. "Which unit?" he asked. "Delta," the man replied grudgingly. "Like you couldn't tell." Mike nodded. "You should have known better then. Best deception is letting your opponent see exactly what they expect." The cleanup took hours. FBI teams arrived to process the scene, documenting how a small town had outmaneuvered one of the most sophisticated criminal operations in the country. "They'll write reports about this," Cooper said, watching the federal agents work. "But they'll miss the real lesson." "That sometimes the pretty face is the perfect cover?" Martinez suggested with a smile. "That, and never underestimate a small town that's learned to use its opponent's assumptions against them," Mike added. As dawn broke over Pine Valley, the town emerged unscathed from what should have been an overwhelming attack. The pretty boy cop had turned his one-time weakness into the town's greatest strength, the ability to be underestimated. Mrs. Henderson appeared with coffee for the officers, just like she had on that first night at the gas station. "Well, pretty boy," she said, handing Mike his cup. "Looks like you taught them the same lesson twice." Mike smiled, watching his town return to normal as the sun rose. Pine Valley had proven once again that appearances could be deceiving, especially when those appearances were carefully crafted to be exactly what your opponents expect to see. The pretty boy cop had become a symbol of something larger, the power of using others' assumptions against them. And somewhere, other small towns were learning the same lesson. The aftermath of Pine Valley's successful defense rippled through law enforcement circles nationwide. Mike found himself fielding calls from agencies across the country, all wanting to understand how a small town had managed to outmaneuver such a sophisticated criminal operation. "It's not just about the tactics," Mike explained during a briefing at FBI headquarters. "It's about understanding how your opponents think, using their assumptions against them. They see a pretty face or a small town and they think they know what they're dealing with." The captured attackers proved to be a goldmine of intelligence. Their organization had been targeting small towns across the country, using military precision to overwhelm local defenses. Pine Valley was supposed to have been their message to other communities. Instead, it had become their downfall. "You know what the real irony is?" "Tut," the captured Delta Force veteran told Mike during interrogation. "We spent weeks studying your defenses, your protocols, your response patterns. Never occurred to us they might all be part of the trap." Back in Pine Valley, life had returned to normal, but something fundamental had changed. The town carried itself differently now, with a quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who they were and what they were capable of. "Got another interview request," Martinez announced during morning briefing. "They're calling it the pretty boy strategy now, using your opponent's expectations against them." Mike shook his head, but he couldn't deny the effectiveness of the label. Throughout history, military leaders had understood the value of being underestimated. Pine Valley had just applied that principle to small-town defense. Mrs. Henderson's civilian network had expanded, connecting with other communities to share information and resources. The gas station where everything started had become a training center, teaching other towns how to transform ordinary businesses into strategic assets. "Remember when they used to laugh at your pretty boy looks?" Tommy asked one day, now running security training for local businesses. "Bet they're not laughing now." The FBI task force had evolved, focusing on helping other communities implement their own versions of the Pine Valley Protocol. But Mike insisted on keeping one crucial element in all their training. "Let them see what they expect to see," he told each new group. "Whether it's a pretty face behind a counter or obvious security measures, your greatest advantage is in being underestimated." Chief Roberts called Mike into his office one morning with unexpected news. "Pentagon's interested in what we've done here. They're studying the pretty boy strategy for possible military applications." Who'd have thought? Mike thought about how far they'd come from that night at the gas station. A simple attempted robbery had evolved into a comprehensive defense strategy, all based on the principle of using appearances to tactical advantage. Jim Harper and his veterans had become official trainers, teaching other communities how to integrate military experience into civilian defense. "You know what's funny?" Jim said during one session. "We spent years trying to look tough, be intimidating. Turns out the best defense is letting them think you're soft." The criminal organizations that had once seen small towns as easy targets were changing their approach. Reports showed them avoiding communities that had implemented the Pine Valley Protocol, unwilling to risk another humiliating defeat. "They can't tell which towns are truly defended and which aren't," Cooper explained during a strategy meeting. "That's the beauty of it. Every pretty face might be hiding a ranger. Every small town might be another Pine Valley." Mike's phone buzzed with a text from his old commanding officer. "Remember when we used to tell you those looks would get you in trouble? Guess they ended up being a tactical advantage after all." The pretty boy cop had become something of a legend in law enforcement circles, but Mike knew the real story wasn't about him. It was about a small town that had learned to turn its perceived weaknesses into strengths. As Mike patrolled Pine Valley's quiet streets that evening, he reflected on the transformation. The town had proved that true strength wasn't about showing force or power. It was about understanding how to use every asset, even those that seemed like liabilities. Mrs. Henderson waved from the hospital entrance during her shift change. "Still keeping us safe, pretty boy?" Mike smiled. remembering how that nickname had evolved from a dismissal to a symbol of tactical deception. Always Mrs. H. Though these days everyone knows better than to underestimate Pine Valley. The sun set over the town that had changed how small communities thought about defense. Somewhere out there, other pretty faces and small towns were learning the same lesson, that sometimes your greatest strength lies in letting others see exactly what they expect to see, while keeping your true capabilities hidden until the moment they're needed. The pretty boy strategy had become more than just a tactic. It had become a philosophy, a reminder that appearances can be the perfect cover for capability, and that being underestimated might just be the greatest tactical advantage of all. 1 year after the initial gas station incident, Pine Valley hosted the first national conference on community defense. Law enforcement officers, veterans, and civilian leaders from across the country gathered to learn what had become known as the Pretty Boy Protocol, using perceived weakness as tactical strength. Mike stood at the podium, looking out over the crowded community center. The same room where he'd once attended town meetings was now filled with representatives from hundreds of small towns, each seeking to protect their communities. A year ago, 3 robbers walked into a gas station, Mike began. They saw what they expected to see, a pretty face behind a counter, an easy target. That mistake changed everything, not just for Pine Valley, but for small towns everywhere. Detective Cooper, now heading the FBI's task force on community defense, presented the statistics. Criminal organizations were avoiding communities that had implemented the protocol, unable to distinguish between truly defended towns and those merely appearing vulnerable. The beauty of the strategy, Cooper explained, is that they can't tell which towns are traps and which aren't. Every pretty face might be hiding a warrior. Every small town might be another Pine Valley. Mrs. Henderson led a session on civilian network organization, sharing how Pine Valley had transformed ordinary citizens into a coordinated defense force. It's not about turning everyone into soldiers, she explained. It's about using what you already have in ways they don't expect. Jim Harper and his veterans demonstrated how military experience could be adapted for community defense. The Warehouse District, once the site of their victory over the tactical teams, had become a training ground for other towns. The pretty boy taught us something important, Jim told his audience. Sometimes the best defense isn't showing your strength, it's making them underestimate it. During breaks, Mike found himself approached by other law enforcement officers, each sharing similar stories. A former Marine working as a school teacher who stopped a robbery, a retired Navy SEAL running a small-town bakery who prevented a kidnapping. Every story reinforced the same lesson. Appearances could be the perfect cover. "Got something to show you," Martinez said, pulling Mike aside during lunch. The success of the Pretty Boy Protocol had transformed Pine Valley and sparked a nationwide movement. Criminal organizations had started warning their members about unassuming targets with the simple warning, "Beware the pretty ones." The gas station security footage from that first night had become a training tool, demonstrating how underestimation could become an advantage. Tommy, now head of business security training, taught other shops how to become strategic assets. "Officer Reynolds taught us that every business, every citizen has something to contribute," he explained. "You just have to know how to use it." At a national conference, the captured Delta Force veteran addressed the crowd, his testimony leaving the audience silent. "We thought we knew what we were dealing with," he admitted. "Never occurred to us that the pretty boy cop had turned the whole town into one big tactical deception." "You know what the best part is?" Mrs. Henderson said, watching conference attendees take photos outside. "Every small town now has a chance to be something more than what others see." As criminal organizations evolved, trying to identify and exploit weaknesses in the protocol, Mike and his team stayed ahead. "They're getting smarter," Cooper announced, "starting to look past the obvious. We need to stay ahead of them." Pine Valley adapted its strategy. Instead of hiding capabilities behind unassuming faces, they displayed them openly. The gas station installed visible security systems, veterans conducted public training exercises, and Mrs. Henderson's civilian network held open meetings. Every action was calculated to make Pine Valley appear exactly as their opponents expected. "It's like that old magic trick," Tommy observed. Make them watch your right hand while the left does the real work. The strategy proved effective. Criminal activity shifted away from towns that openly displayed protocol measures, directly into communities that had quietly implemented more sophisticated defenses. They're targeting towns that don't fit their profile, Cooper reported, walking right into traps because they think they've learned to spot our methods. Mike's phone buzzed with a message from his old commanding officer. Double bluff strategy? You always did like playing mind games with the enemy. The pretty boy cop had evolved along with his tactics, letting his reputation precede him, knowing that sometimes the best way to hide your true strength was to display it openly. Jim Harper and his veterans had established training programs nationwide, teaching communities how to use their unique characteristics to their advantage. The protocol had evolved beyond simple tactical deception into a comprehensive philosophy of community defense, with each town adapting the principles to their specific needs. 2 years after that fateful night, Mike stood at the gas station counter, now retired from active duty but serving as a national consultant. The store had been preserved as a reminder of where it all began. Hard to believe it started right here, Mrs. Henderson said. 3 robbers thinking they'd found an easy target in a pretty face. Cooper, now head of the FBI's Community Defense Division, shared the latest statistics. 2 years since the protocol went national, criminal organizations are completely shifting their strategies. They can't tell which targets are real anymore. The gas station had become a symbol, its simple interior preserved as a reminder that strength often hides in unexpected places. Pine Valley had transformed into a training center, hosting law enforcement and community leaders from across the country. The hospital where Mrs. Henderson worked now hosted regional training sessions on emergency response and community coordination. Every town has its own version now, Tommy said, manning the register. Some hide their capabilities, some show them off. Nobody knows which is which. The Pretty Boy Protocol had evolved beyond tactical deception into a comprehensive philosophy of community defense. It's not just about defense anymore, Cooper explained. It's about community identity, towns understanding who they are and what they're capable of. As night fell over Pine Valley, Mike prepared to share his story with a new group of trainees. The lesson isn't about hiding or showing strength, he began. It's about understanding that true capability isn't about appearances at all. It's about being ready, being united, being more than what others expect you to be. The legacy of Pine Valley would continue, evolving and adapting as new challenges arose. But the core lesson would remain the same. Never judge capability by appearance, whether it's a pretty face behind a counter or a small town on a map. The Pretty Boy Cop had taught them all that true strength often hides in plain sight, waiting for the moment when being underestimated becomes your greatest advantage. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.